Hello, everyone. I am here with the wonderful Professor Inga Wolframm, and she is here to talk to us today about the other presentation that she did on her other piece of work, which I won't introduce. I'll leave Inga to introduce herself and her work that she's been doing.
Thanks so much, Chloe, and really great to be here again with you. Yeah, I can imagine that you had quite a lot to do while we were in Fort Collins, so we sort of had to stagger them, a released stagger, which is always nice. Sort of, keep the good feeling that we had from Fort Collins going.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I wanted to also talk to you guys about I call it landscape of choice. The good news is the research has been published by now as well, so it is actually available for people to read, which I'd obviously encourage everybody to do. So why did I do this research? One of my biggest research lines, in addition to what you all know that I do, decision making, eye tracking, etc., but is looking at biodiversity and the interaction with equine management. And the reason is that I think as an equine sector, as the world gets smaller, or it feels as if it's getting smaller, it also means that as an industry, as a sector, we also have social responsibility. So not just obviously looking after the things that we do with our horses, I mean, obviously that's essential, but also the role we have to play in the bigger context. And if we think about it, when you have horses, you also have land, because at the end of the day, that's really where we keep our horses on. It's an extensive way of really managing the land. But if we're looking at the bigger context of what's happening in the natural world as a whole, then the picture's starting to get quite scary. Climate change is real, and one of the effects of climate change is the staggering loss of biodiversity. And that means with regards to loss of species, different species, but also the number of individual animals. So it's not just that we're having less diversity, but we also have fewer numbers. And we are actually currently in the 6th mass extinction of species. Now, Chloe, here's the question for you. Trick question. No, not really. Do you have any idea when the 5th mass extinction was?
No, I actually don't.
It was when the dinosaurs died out.
Wow.
And in many ways, well, to be honest, I already think it's quite scary to think that we've already been through this 6 times over, that we've lost that many species. But the fact that now it's the times that we're in right now, so the species loss and the rapid rate of species loss is equivalent to when the dinosaurs died out, is actually quite scary. And what's perhaps the scariest of it all, that it's all man-made. So there is no meteorite that darkened the sun, but this time it's on us. And that also means that we also have a responsibility to do something about it, I think, anyway, and then obviously, what can we do as horse owners? And one of the things, and this is where sort of equine welfare and biodiversity comes together, is if you think about it, keeping horses on land basically means it's an extensive use of using the land. But then, when we were in Fort Collins, we also talked a lot about this concept of agency, which is tricky in and of itself, because agency actually goes further than freedom of choice. Agency actually means that the horse can decide on what to do, which arguably, because they are kept in captivity, the whole agency concept becomes slightly more complex. But still, where possible, I think this idea that horses do have the right to choose, if I can put it like this, in addition to obviously the five domains model that we're looking at, how can we improve welfare? All of us, I think, realize that welfare is not one dimensional. There's several dimensions to it, and a life worth living doesn't always mean everything always has to be hunky-dory. But it does mean that we need to look at providing sufficient positive experiences to that weigh up the negative experiences, and obviously, there's certain negative experience that we need to avoid at all costs, but it's this balance. And I think one of the important aspects to this is the other 23 hours. And again, we talked about this a lot. And when we put all of this together, I'm interested in trying to see how we can design landscapes for horses that align with our broader need of increasing biodiversity, but also provide horses with an environment that suits the individual needs, but also lets them have a modicum of agency, of freedom of choice. And this is really the background to it all. One of it's becoming fast my biggest by far research area is this: how can we design equine yards that align with biodiversity, landscape quality, obviously equine welfare, and also financial sustainability, because at the end of the day, that's also really quite important. But what's underneath all of this, once you do this, you also need to know, okay, how do horses want to interact with their landscape? And obviously, there's been quite a lot of research that's been done on, time budgets of horses in the wild and also of domesticated horses in different settings. But what really interested me was, how do horses interact with individual landscape features? We also call this green-blue infrastructure. And then I'm talking about ponds, about rivers, about hedgerows, about tree rows, individual trees, wild hedges, all these different features that make up a landscape. And so what I wanted to know, so if you give horses the choice in a natural setting where all of these different landscape features are available, what would they choose? And I had the wonderful opportunity of reanalyzing data that was collected they actually did 3 rounds of data collection, but I used data from 2021. That was in Sweden, in a large Swedish nature reserve, where a group of sport horse mares, so there were Swedish Warmbloods, jumpers, they were, left out to do their own thing for 5 months in this nature reserve, and they were being fitted with sensors. It's the HoofStep system. And essentially, it's a combination of a GPS sensor and a gyroscope that allows the measurement of horses. And the whole system is fitted with an algorithm that the companies worked on for several years to make sure that it actually measures the behavior that we think it measures. It's always very useful. But essentially, it meant that the data that I got at the end, I was able to distinguish, what were the horses actually doing in these landscapes. And I'm just gonna share now. So this is the paper, and perhaps it's actually quite nice. I want to show you the slides, but perhaps it's actually even nicer to use the paper because everybody can see it there as well. If you have a look, so what we did in GIS, in a GIS software program, we made a stylized impression of the area that the horses were kept in. And as you can see, we identified the different types of landscape features, which you can see here on the legend on the left-hand side. And what we then did, we sort of mapped the horses that were, determined through the sensors on top of this. And I must admit, I didn't do this. I did this together. That bit, my colleague Thomas Engels did this for me. He's our GIS expert, and I'm ever so grateful because I could have never done this without him. And obviously with 2 colleagues from HoofStep, who sort of gave feedback, gave inputs, and then up to me to do the statistics. But so that's that. But you see, and now comes the clue to this whole thing. What you can do, obviously, you can analyze equine behavior in absolute terms, which essentially means that you sort of look at, okay, so how much time do they spend somewhere? But then obviously what you would get is I can already tell you without having to run the statistics, is also spend the most amount of time in the open landscape, simply because That's the biggest part of the land. Make sense?
Yes.
But the question is, what do people actually choose, irrespective of the size? And what I mean by this, and I sort of liken this to a house with different rooms in it. We all do different behaviors at different times of day. Do we always do them in the same room if we're being given a choice? No, the answer is no. And sometimes a room can have particular meaning, even though you might not spend all your time in it. But in terms of welfare, in terms of the ability to be able to choose, it can have a huge impact. And in my particularly facetious moments, I use the analogy of the loo, in the sense that I don't spend all my time on the loo, but I'm really very happy that I have a loo in my house. And I'd like to, I'd like to claim that this is really very important for my personal welfare. But how do you calculate this? Seeing that obviously the open landscape is so big in comparison. And there's this nifty technique that's called the Manley selection criteria. And those of you who are really interested in it, have a look in the paper and read up on it. But essentially what it does, it calculates the proportion of use in relation to the availability of the landscape. So essentially what you do is you look at how big is a particular landscape feature compared to the whole of the area. And then you measure how much time an animal spends in that landscape feature compared to how much time they spend doing that particular behavior across the whole day. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
And then you divide the one by the other, which essentially means if horses spend as much time in a particular landscape feature as, comparatively speaking, the landscape feature is in terms of size compared to the bigger size, you come out at 1. So if a horse spends as much time in a landscape feature as it would if that landscape feature was as big as the whole of the environment, it comes out as 1. If the number that emerges from that division is greater than 1, we know that horses choose to spend more time in that landscape feature than the size of the landscape feature would suggest. Okay, now the check with you, Chloe. So you are my audience now. Are you still with me on that?
I'm still with you, yes.
Excellent. Because once we come to grips with this, the next few graphs will actually make sense. So we did lots of statistics, and here now we come to my graphs, and here we are. So this one line here, the 1, that's our, if you like, our baseline. So that basically means that horses spend as much time in that landscape feature as we would expect. And what you can see here, where we look at open landscape, it's higher than 1, but we also see woodland, which is much, much lower. And if we have a look at this again, this is the woodland, and they were really, really dense woodlands, which basically meant the horses didn't really want to spend any time in it, hardly at all, which basically means that they spend, comparatively speaking, slightly more time in the open landscape feature. However, then we have a look at some of the other landscape features, and then it becomes really interesting, because the pool for highly active behavior, which is all sorts of things, cantering, trotting, but also sort of moving the head around energetically, etc., etc. That is 15 times greater than you would expect. Same goes for individual trees. The blackberry patch, which is also very popular. The sand pit. So we can already see here a pattern emerging in the sense that horses actually, they choose different types of landscape features according to the, well, for starters, which is not just according to their availability, but also in relation to different types of behaviors. We can already see that, okay, so the pool and the individual trees were a bit playgrounds. The sand bit was perhaps a favorite place for resting, as was the blackberry patch. And because I mean, I've never been there, but I've seen lots of videos of that area. And the sand pits, they were sort of let into undulating landscapes. So I can already see the horses sort of that they were actually sort of nestled into the hillside, if you like. So that's sort of my explanation. So this is already quite interesting because it indicates that horses do choose different landscape features according to different types of behaviors. But then we also looked at different types of climatic conditions. You know, what did they do when it started to rain? This one I like a lot, that when it started to rain a lot, they all flocked to the sand pit. And I think all of us know what they did there. Then they started to roll. Because, you know, their coats were wet. And then any horse, you know, we all know that once we've ridden our horses and they are a bit sweaty, or if we've just given them a shower, I think you can give them no greater pleasure than to let them roll afterwards, which is great when you've got a grey like I do. But my tip for the uninitiated, if they all of a sudden turned into into sort of a muddy horse, just let it dry and brush it off, and then it doesn't stick. If you try and brush it off when it's still wet, you end up with a brown horse. But anyway. Again, we also looked at the effect of higher temperatures. We also see that there was an increase of moving towards open landscapes, which might have had something to do with flies, by the way. But perhaps even most excitingly is this. These are the individual horses. And I'm showing you guys the graphs, but I can already tell you that there's also significant differences. And what we can see here, that horses choose different landscape features. They choose different rooms, as it were. And I think that's perhaps, to me, that was one of the most important aspects of this research. It's not rocket science. We all know that every horse is different, but it is really quite exciting to see it, and to also see the statistical significance that's come out of all of this. You know, there's lots of tables that give you all the, you know, all the stats surrounding this, but you can see that horse F is a bit of a beach babe. You know, she liked to hang about by the pool, while G and B, they really enjoyed the individual trees while you don't see them all that much by the pool. So there's a very, very clear differentiation. Horse D didn't have clear preferences for one of these as the other two did, but individual trees, blackberry patch and pool, and a bit of sandpit. So what we can actually see here is some very definite individualized profiles. And yes, at this point, we're not quite able to talk to horses, but I think this already comes pretty close. And you know, the neat thing is that one of the slogans of HoofStep, who make these sensors, and we give the horse a voice. And I think this is really a very, very good visualization of us giving the horse a voice, because these were very young mares, between 1 and 3. And if you know this, then you could even sort of think about, okay, so I know that this particular horse really likes a pool. So, you know, why not dig a pool, which is also really good for biodiversity. But it also shows that, you know, if you don't have the opportunity to have these sensors, even though they are available, what you can then also do when you see this, you can just think of, okay, so can I not just design my own terrain so that it includes some of these landscape features? So I'm already giving my horses a choice, and that they can actually choose where they want to be, depending on the time of day, the climatic conditions, but also their individual preferences. And when we now sort of move back to the, you know, what I sort of started with, the bigger societal issue, or rather, you know, solution perhaps even, when we do this, when we design yards that include tree rows, individual trees, wild hedges, or blackberry patch, I didn't have a wild hedge here, but I had a blackberry patch. So, but also sand pits. We are actually helping our horses. We're helping our horses. We're helping the welfare of our horses, but we're also helping nature, which basically means that us as a sector, we can also show that we have a broader societal role to play, and that we can really contribute to biodiversity, nature resilience, and of course, making life for our horses, well, not just a little bit, but quite a bit better. And really, that's sort of then I'm sort of thinking the end. No, but that's, and the thing is that in many ways, this is really quite, well, you can make it as easy or as complicated as you want, obviously, but you can already start with, just including a few, just plant a few extra hedges. The nice thing is, obviously, I don't know all the subsidies available in all the different countries, but in most European countries, there's lots of schemes now also for private homeowners to apply for some funding to help with, planting trees and planting hedges, digging pools. So I think to horse owners, this is a really lovely way to sort of increase welfare, but also show their societal engagement. Perhaps a word of caution. So to anybody who now wants to go out and dig a pool, please do check with your local council first, because sometimes you do need planning permission. So, and it's really quite important. And I know a lot of horse owners are very much, they're very quick to sort of, well, I've heard this many times before, that they kind of do this stuff because they feel the need to do it, but they do it without the planning permission, and then they sort of keep hidden away, because they're worried that the council will be difficult in giving planning permission. So my tip of the day is try and speak the language of the council. Have a look first what their policy is on biodiversity, and then approach the council and say, hey, I can see that, you're also trying to increase green-blue infrastructure, because most European councils do have strategies, because they have to, because, we have a European strategy that sort of says we have to achieve green-blue infrastructure, we have to increase it quite a bit in 2050. By 2050, 10% of the rural landscape needs to include green-blue infrastructure, and we're nowhere near that yet. But if you talk to the council in their language, rather than saying, I want to do this for my horse, but if you're saying, we want to support local biodiversity, the chances of success are much greater.
Wonderful. And I think, as you said from the start, you always leave me stumped with questions, but I think maybe more comments. But as you said at the beginning, and as I've experienced over time as well, especially recently with more people like you and equine academic researchers, creating more of an interdisciplinary approach, and working with, so instead of finishing like their studies in a particular area that, I don't know, that they're an expert in, collaborating with the people that they need to collaborate with, for example, lawyers, or as you said, conservationists, or people that are into biodiversity. I don't know what they're called, but
ecologists.
Ecologists, that's the one.
Yeah, precisely.
That's the one. And
landscape designers, I do lots of work with landscape designers.
Exactly. So I think actually starting to move forward now, and we have the data to support that, complexities in a horse's environment, or ones that support species typical behavior, increase behavioral diversity as well, not just biodiversity. So we can really work together with people that are experts in particular areas and really move forwards in the industry. And also, like, I think the increasing the biodiversity will reduce your instances of poaching and like the horses messing up the fields, because
Yeah.
they're more engaged in other behaviors rather than just standing around. Kind of the only thing they can do is kind of walk and run and graze, um,
Or fight.
or
Because
fight.
this is the
Yes,
other
yes,
thing.
yes, yes, yeah,
Because to be honest, if they've got nothing else to do, what they're going to do?
yeah. They have frustrations. It's built up frustration,
Absolutely.
and it can
Also,
create
the hanging
tensions.
up by the, hanging out by the fence. How many times have I sort of spoken to people about, turnout, and
Mm,
um and then they're saying, yeah, but my horse is, is standing at the fence after half an hour, and I'm saying, okay, but what's in that paddock? Well, nothing. Well, yeah, duh. Sorry. So it's also, this whole, we talk about freedom, friends, and forage, yeah, if we want to sort of be quick and dirty, but and in many ways we've always talked about the freedom to move, but I would like to suggest that we actually that we add another F, and that's fun. I think Andrew had another one, and I can't quite but so the whole fun engagement, but also it's not just freedom to move, but it's also freedom to choose. But providing horses with different features to engage with, you give them freedom to choose of what to do. And there we're getting a little bit closer to this idea of agency.
That's
Even in our,
exactly, yeah. That's exactly what I said when I first heard of the three Fs. I can't remember if I just came up with it. I'd love to believe that I did. But I'm sure someone's come up with it years before me, before I even probably went to university. So, but yeah, absolutely. Freedom to not, it's not just freedom of movement, it's freedom of choice, and as you said, agency too. In their species typical environment, they have choices over every single well, not everything, most things. Actually, I want to be as far as say all things, because even if they are in a particular situation, they have the choice to react and respond in the way that they want to, whereas in domestication they don't have those opportunities as much. So absolutely, it's a key fundamental need in a horse and in any animal and species.
yeah,
Key
absolutely.
is, otherwise they wouldn't have survived as a species.
Yeah,
um and same with us as well, so absolutely very key.
yeah.
um
So this is,
yeah,
so perhaps this also, now you know why I was so keen to do this, because I'm so excited about this, because I think in many ways it allows us, and and you can make it as complicated or as simple as you want, but you can literally start today, just we're obviously in the northern hemisphere, we're sort of moving into autumn, which basically means lots of tree branches. Do make sure that they are not poisonous to horses, but that kind of thing. But also even providing horses with edible branches, for example. Willow is something that horses, well, I've not met a horse that doesn't like willow. Even just providing them with something like that, something to occupy them. You don't have to necessarily. Well, willow trees are amazing, by the way. They're just fantastic. You just sort of stick a tree. You just literally stick a branch in the ground and it grows. It's fantastic. It's my favorite tree. But horses really love it. If you have an FEI horse, I sort of feel that I kind of need to say this. If you have an FEI registered horse, a little bit can't do any harm, but it is a controlled medication, which basically means that there is a threshold, because there's salicin in the bark of the willow tree, which is essentially a painkiller, and it is a controlled substance. So if you do have an FEI horse and you don't want to, you don't want to take any risks, the literature says, but there's not a lot of literature on horses and willow and stuff, but referring, or that sort of can sort of um gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, you can make inferences. Sorry, that was what I was looking for from the available literature. I say between 3 to 5 days, but I think on the safe side, I wouldn't give them anything for 2 weeks. But the amounts of salicin that they'd have to eat literally hundreds of grams, and so that, you know, of that stuff. But still, I sort of feel that because this is a kind of a podcast, I sort of feel that sort of, now that I've said give them willow, you know, that they don't come back and say, yeah, we
Yeah,
just
you're gonna get a letter through
we
the
fell
mail.
foul of the doping regulations. So
Yeah,
there.
100,000 pounds through the mail. Yeah.
Yeah, that. Yeah, well, that.
What was I gonna say? I think what people also just need to think about is that even if they don't have that much space, you can utilize the space. You can still encourage movement and forward
Yep.
movement by rearranging kind of, and because there's things like track systems and equicentral that has been
Mhm.
getting quite popular as well. So if you're not able to put all of the fields that you have together, if you do have multiple fields, if you can't put them all together and you need to think about obviously social dynamics and how that will work and introducing horses properly, but if you don't have that opportunity, again, making use of what you have, and encouraging kind of interaction with their environment and movement, essentially, which, if anyone's interested, there is quite a lot of work on how to make use of your land.
Yep.
And working with, I'm sure people would be very keen to work with horse and yard owners to see how they can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, and you know, and you don't always have to open up your fields, because we also need to think about rotational grazing. So it's not actually, it's, you know, it's actually quite useful to think about different zones. But you know what, I'm working a lot with different types of designing, you know, how to design landscape features that also complement the regional characteristics, because that's the one thing with track systems, is that it's a concept, and I'm not knocking this at all, because I think track systems are great, especially when you have limited ground, that you sort of think about, okay, how do we do this? But I think especially when you want to improve biodiversity, you need to think about the type of landscape characteristics that are common in your area, and try and let them be, and try and integrate them into your system, simply because otherwise the species that are in the surrounding areas, they're not going to come anyway. So you need to sort of make sure that the characteristics that you use them, and also in that sense that also helps with planning permissions and stuff. If you're saying you're actually doing something to enhance the landscape quality, which is also of benefit to the neighborhood, then again, it's also about, well, the social license to operate in the broadest sense. This is also about us showing that we have something more to offer than just us doing stuff with our horses. We can
And
also
when
create landscapes that are beautiful rather than just muddy fields.
Absolutely, when you say you utilizing what you have around you, do you mean like using plants and substrates and stuff that are or like local, if that makes sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you definitely need to make sure that you use local trees, hedges, plants. But also think about, say you live in an area where they use lots of hedges, where, you know, hedges is the thing, and all of a sudden, and you decide to plant lots of tree rows that are very open. Um, that it depends a little bit on the landscape that you're in, but that's then something that you might consider. Okay, should I perhaps also do more hedges? Which obviously in the UK, you know, hedges is, you know, here in the Netherlands, everybody always talks about the UK with hedges, but you know, I happen to know that you've also lost quite a few hedges in the UK, but still. Um, but in the Netherlands, even though we're a tiny, tiny country, we've got 17 different landscape types with subcategories as well. So, you know, towards the west, you know, the Hollands, it's very much open. So you wouldn't really start planting lots of hedgerows around every single yard, but you'd be working more with tree rows that are open, that still allows, you know, the vista. While the area that I live in, which is called the Gelderse Vallei, it's much more sort of cozy. You know, you'd be having the farmhouse at the front, and you'd have hedges surrounding the farmhouse, and then you'd have you'd have the fields, if you like, at the back. But there, because they were relatively smaller fields, you'd have hedgerows surrounding them. You might also have some tree rows supporting this individual groups of trees within the fields. It depends a bit on, what kind of field it is, but they are different characteristics, and that's important because the surrounding fauna and of course flora as well, but the surrounding fauna will also use these landscape features for their habitats. But if you have fauna that's not really used to wide open spaces, they've still got nowhere else to go, or vice versa. So in that sense, if we obviously we're always interested in equine welfare, but if we try and sort of think outside the box, or literally outside of the yard, and try and also integrate this, then we become if you like, a habitat host for different types of species, so not just for our horses.
Amazing.
So it's
Yeah.
cool, right?
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. I really love hearing. I was literally saying, people are probably going to hear this again, but I was literally saying to um, uh, Gabriel Lencioni yesterday how every time someone does a talk, talks to me on the interviews, I just want to do what they're doing. So I want to become an expert in AI, biodiversity now,
I
racehorse
know.
welfare. I know it's just like impossible.
No, it's cool though. Oh yeah, AI, that's also good.
Yeah,
Starting that as well. No,
yeah.
but okay, another talk for another day. No, but this is also good though, and it's fun that we have such a versatile sector.